It is officially 2 minutes past the hour, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. Welcome to our webinar, Commuters and Business Travelers, Compliance Issues with a panel discussion here. My name is Steve Hoffman, Director of Business Development with GTN. And today's webinar is brought to you by Alliant Employee Benefits, GTN Global Tax Network, and Livitt Mendelson. This is our third and our final installment of our three-part webinar series on how to respond to the new remote workers. The first webinar and the second webinar we did in February and March, the long-term worker and the short-term worker are both available on our website. So if you go to gtn.com under the events tab, they're available for download. Today's webinar, how to respond to business travelers and commuter conundrum, that will be available on our website in roughly, it should be less than 24 hours. So if for some reason you get pulled out and you want to come back to this, you can download that and listen to it at a more convenient time for yourselves. Now, some logistics. As always, our attendees are muted, but you will have the opportunity to ask questions. So if you want to ask a question, please use the chat box, and we'll get to as many questions as possible. If for some reason we are not able to get to those questions in the allotted time provided, we'll follow up with an email with those answers that we have for you. So we have continuing education. The first is our friends over at Ruoff Mortgage were kind enough to sponsor the continuing education credits. So for the live version for this webinar, it is 16559. 16559, and for the recorded version, that seminar ID is 16558, 16558. And then our friends over at Quicken Loans were kind enough to sponsor the SHRM and HRCI credits. So the SHRM activity ID is 21-VWXKQ. Again, that's 21-VWXKQ. And then the HRCI activity ID is 556910. Again, that's 556910. And then this brings us pretty much to the end of my opening slides, where we do have a great panel. They're all listed right here, but rather than me talk about them, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and ask all of my panelists, our panelists, to introduce themselves.
Number one, I got here first again. Beat you, David.
All right.
Amazing. Well done, Richard.
All right, so we're still waiting for one more, Trent. You can do it.
Come on, Trent, press that button. Press that button all together now. Brent, right. Oh, yeah, you must have been a minute behind us.
Excellent. Excellent. We're all here. We're all professionals. 15 months in the pandemic, we know how to use these pretty well. Well, to start things off, I want to just again ask everybody to introduce themselves, say a little bit about themselves, and we're going to start off with Becky Woods, the newest addition to the panel. Becky, if you could please go ahead.
Great, thanks, Steve, and great to be with you all today. I'm Becky Woods, Senior Director of Global Mobility at ADP. I've been at ADP a little over 4 years, been in the industry about 14 years, and I'm based in Northern New Jersey.
Excellent. Richard.
Hi there, Richard Polak. I'm the senior global advisor for Alliant, and senior meaning probably the oldest one on the panel, and a senior. In fact, this year I'll be eligible for Medicare, which means, of course, I can't have certain prescription drugs covered, and then I'll have to go to Canada to get those. But I have better health care because I live in Beverly Hills and not Los Angeles. I'm actually on the border, so we get better health care in Beverly Hills. That's actually the truth. It's sad truth, actually. But that's not my background. Background is that I've been in the business 44 years and covered every possible topic you can talk about until one comes up that I've never seen before, which will happen here today. And thank God I got a team around me that I've known for a long time, except for Becky. I've just met Becky. I'm very glad to be here to help everybody out if I can.
Thanks, Richard. And I think you've taken that 40+ years and you wrote a book about it, did you not, recently?
Oh, yes. Oh, thank you for that. Thanks for the plug. In fact, I just happen to have a copy here. called WorkSmart, just released Tuesday, the #1 new release on Amazon, thanks to all my friends and family. After 44 years, I said, finally pulled in a favor. So thanks for everybody for buying the book. It's really about productivity and a lot of the topics we talk about in HR. Thanks, Steve, for mentioning.
You bet. All right, now to my friend and colleague, David Livitt.
Thanks, Steve. Yes, David Livitt, the National Practice Leader here at GTN for business travelers and remote workers. Been here 3 years almost, 20 plus years experience in mobility tax. And Richard, can I have a signed copy of your book, please?
Yes, you can sign it when you buy it. Yeah, absolutely. No, of course you can. I'd love to. Once this is all over, we get together for sure.
Fantastic.
All right, last but certainly not least, all the way over in Singapore, we have Trent Sutton.
Hey, it's great to be here. I am the only one wearing a tie because I'm the only lawyer on the panel. So I had to live up to the name. I am an employment lawyer, so I really do focus a lot of my work on cross-border issues when employers are trying to deal with things like this. I've got employees traveling or moving across borders or stuck in foreign countries or rolling out a new work from home policy that's going to touch multiple countries. I help on compliance.
And just for the record, so everybody knows, that is not a virtual background. That is an actual office you're sitting in right now, correct?
Yes, it is. We're in Singapore and we come back to work. 75% of us can come back. So here I am at almost midnight. Nobody's here.
Almost looks like 100% of you are there, actually.
That's true. All of me is here, as the song goes.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody. And let's go ahead and start with the first question, or rather scenario. We're going to start off with business travelers. So at the beginning of 2020, we had a lot of business travelers conducting business as usual. And then COVID-19 struck, and many employers had instances where some of the employees actually got stuck and are still stuck in those countries today. Both Becky and Trent have a couple of really interesting stories on this topic, and I'd like them, if they would mind sharing it, and then the rest of the panel can comment on it. Becky, can we go ahead and start with you and your scenario, please?
Great, yeah, thanks. And actually, ADP did a pretty good job at the beginning of COVID. We sent out a notice in January of 2020 halting all business travel. So the vast majority of our 60,000 employees were able to get home. We did, have a few instances here or there. I have an employee who's a US-based associate, but he regularly travels to Singapore, and he's been doing so for a few years. And the good news was he was already on our radar, and he had already been there long enough that we knew he was liable for taxes there. So we had already set up the compliance around paying taxes in Singapore. But when we found out he actually did get stuck in Singapore due to the COVID lockdowns and is actually even still there today, all of a sudden, all these issues started popping up. Things like, he was on normal business travel before, so he was staying in a hotel and reimbursing his meals. And after a few months, it was brought to our attention and said, wait a minute, like maybe there needs to be a more cost-effective solution to this. And then things around health insurance, he was there long enough, he needed to go see a doctor. How could we help support him with that? So we needed to put some infrastructure in place and kind of turn him into a quasi assignment in order to help best support him while he was stuck there.
Never a dull moment in our business, huh? But certainly the best stories come out of global mobility. David, do you have any thoughts on that? I know she said she took care of they took care of a lot of the tax issues ahead of time. But...
Yeah, I think the sort of thoughts going through my head, it's almost like an exam, this one actually, a test. So a sort of a macro level, we'd obviously ask some of the questions that would be from a tax perspective. What the frequency of the original business travel, and obviously the individual then got stuck. So typically we'd look to the immediate, is there a tax treaty between the two countries, so US and Singapore? There isn't in this scenario. So that again, there's an immediate alert there around risk for tax purposes. We then look at, corporate arrangements, is there an entity there? And I think Becky said there is. So again, that sort of helps with some of the issues around payroll delivery. We look at social security. And then, again, is there an agreement between the two countries? And again, there isn't. So again, we look at these are sort of the macro level, what we do right at the very start before we drill into the individual's personal circumstances. From a corporate perspective and employer perspective, we then look to, well, what's the payroll arrangements between the two countries? Is a US employee working in Singapore? What does that look like? Where should withholding be withheld? Is there double withholding, so a shadow payroll is required, etc., etc., all those sorts of things. And there's other sort of little quirky rules in Singapore to be aware of as well. Certainly now we're sort of opening back up, and if the individual was then to come back to the US, and I don't know whether in this case it's happened just yet, but there's an exit tax in Singapore as well. So any sort of equity that's not vested and that sort of thing can be taxed at the point of departure. So again, there's sort of hidden costs for the employer. And I think that's the thing around sort of business travelers, whether that's someone who's stuck and extended, or someone who's going backwards and forwards between various locations. There's a risk, whether there's a treaty or not, around the domestic rules requiring shadow payroll, maybe some sort of social security double payment as well, and then ultimately maybe some payment of taxation, filing, and compliance around those sorts of things as well. So again, back to tracking, knowing where your employees are, what they're doing is really important, and then we can look to the tax laws to see what the final position is. So a lot to unpack on that one, actually. So I imagine that was quite an interesting. Initially, what do you need to do straight away? But then there's probably a future state for that individual as well.
I would imagine some good business traveler tracking tools would have been very useful at the beginning of the pandemic. Becky, are you able to disclose whether or not you guys had one in place?
Well, yeah, no, we don't have a formalized business traveler tracking tool, but what's interesting is we're heavily looking into one now. And what I've noticed is, especially with the rise of these temporary remote worker requests, a lot of the tech solutions around business travelers, I see them being tweaked and modified to also accommodate for these temporary remote workers. So it's great that we can leverage existing technology to help solve this new problem.
Oh, all right. And Richard, you want to share your thoughts on this with respect to your employee benefits expertise?
Yeah, remember there's 4 core benefits we talk about or mostly concerned about. There are many, many fringe benefits, but there's retirement, and that's not necessarily an issue here. It does come into play. Wait, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have spoken to, because you have the CPF in Singapore that you transferred to. Then you have your disability. I'll talk about that, medical, and then any death benefits. So death benefits are rather simple. A person can die anywhere and get a death benefit paid to the beneficiary. If he's under the U.S. plan, that death benefit would go tax-free to the beneficiary. And when the individual transferred to Singapore, that's a whole nother area in all 4 subjects. But with respect to retirement, that would still follow the person when they're in Singapore, assuming they're still on the U.S. payroll. And the medical, well, the disability also will follow them. The problem with the disability is, depending how the policy is written, it may not cover the individual. It becomes disabled. Certainly wouldn't pay them because they can't administer a policy in Singapore. So they may ask the individual to come back home or the home country, wherever the policy, in order to get those disability benefits. With respect to medical, the U.S. policy will likely cover worldwide. Now, I don't know your policy, Becky, but you'd likely have some form of a PPO or HMO, and he has an out-of-network issue. And then you'd want to say, oh, okay, so he's going to be out of network for sure. What can we provide him in Singapore? And I kind of cheated because I asked Becky before the call what she did, and she did put them on a Singapore program, and there's private programs in Singapore. In fact, I want to ask you, Trent, all this time, if you're under a local, you're in a similar situation, right? You're US, you were seconded over to Singapore. Are you on a Singapore medical policy?
No, I'm still on an international policy treated as a secondee.
Oh, okay. So you're on a Cigna, an Aetna, GeoBlue. You want to, okay, I see. So, right, Becky, and also cheated. I asked her about the international policies. I'm going to speak for you, Becky, and please correct me if I'm wrong. But they don't have many on those kinds of policies, so that is an option. But they're very expensive. So for a lawyer that's highly paid, like Trent is, and he can require it from his employer, and they'd be happy to get them to go to Singapore on the policy. And they're really good policies, by the way, and that's why they're so expensive. Really not so expensive. They're as expensive as they are because they provide great benefits. So in this case, long story short, Becky put the individual on the Singapore policy, and therefore, if Becky's on the Singapore payroll now.
We are paying Singapore taxes for him at the end of the year.
He's on a CPF, which is about 17%, actually huge contribution if he's under age 55, 70% employer contribution into that fund. And that will cover him now in the retirement, and he'll do just fine.
All right.
Thank you.
All right, well, and then Trent, if you wouldn't mind sharing your thoughts on that, and then maybe just go right into your scenario. It's probably very similar to Becky's.
Yeah, you know, I from the employment perspective, you know, we typically think of business travelers on our side when somebody's in the normal circumstance traveling regularly for a company. You know, the employment rules or the employment risks tend to be more along the lines of, well, what's the liability to the company if they get injured when they're traveling? Right? So we've got workers' comp laws or their duty of care, which we'll talk about later. In a situation, the problems we've been seeing now, and we've talked about the long and the short term wandering workers in the prior two programs. The problem we have now is these sort of mistaken long-term business travelers who end up being stuck in these foreign locations. And so a lot of what we've indicated in these prior programs applies in a situation like this. And I'll remind you of the basic premise that when it comes to an individual's entitlements under the law, and remember that outside the United States, like lots of countries have lots of protections for employees. In the US, we're still sort of Wild West, you know, take care of yourself kind of a place. Everywhere else, they have mandatory vacation and mandatory child leave and mandatory this and mandatory pay and protection from termination. All these things in a lot of countries apply. So the question is, where's their place of employment? I go into that spiel to say, normally we think we can choose it as the employer. We say your office is in this case, you know, the United States, but now this individual's been traveling and is now stuck in Singapore for some undefined time. If he's habitually now working, or she's working from Singapore now for an indefinite period, and she's been here 6 months, 8 months, a year, you could say, arguably, the risk to the company is that her place of employment has changed to Singapore. So what does that mean? The Employment Act of Singapore now applies to her. If your entitlements in the United States don't necessarily meet the entitlements or the minimum entitlements in Singapore, then there could be some gaps that an individual employee could take advantage of, or perhaps that the local authorities could audit. So we always need to be careful about those situations. Now, not all countries are challenging, and not all countries will impose their employment rules on an offshore employer, but most of them could, if in fact you could show the place of employment had changed. So I'll give you an example here. Singapore is great. Becky's example is great. We've got somebody who traveled back and forth. The biggest issue is, are they reporting taxes and providing that? On the employment side, really it just means, okay, I can't fire them at will, really. I have to give them notice before I fire them. And probably ADP's providing, you know, leaves for annual vacation, which are in excess of what minimum entitlements are. There's relatively few protections in Singapore. So that's great. I'll tell you the reverse situation we had recently where this situation came up. During the pandemic, we had an individual from Singapore decide that they needed to go home because their grandmother was sick. So they left to go home for a few short weeks, right? And then India kind of exploded with the virus, and Singapore closed its borders. So 2 weeks turned into a month, turned into 2 months, turned into 3 months. And the company was finally sitting there going, look, on a corporate tax issue, we have an employee at this point now sitting in India working for us from India for 5 months. And they're starting to worry about corporate tax issues like agency PE, or have we established a service PE because of the kinds of duties that she's doing for us while she's in India. We don't have any operations in India. We don't have any company in India. How long can we let her stay there? And they were faced with the situation of saying, you have to be back by May 8th. They just gave her this, it's been long enough. You have to come back, okay? And then in the interim, then Singapore really closed its borders and said, now we're not letting any Indians in as of 2 weeks ago or a week ago. She's not coming back for I don't know how long. So at this point now we're saying, how do we terminate this individual? Now I could do it under Singapore's laws. Absolutely, give them the notice, give them the annual leave. But she's been there 5 months. Fortunately, India is one of those locations where it's not necessarily going to impose its employment laws on an offshore entity. So that makes the employment side relatively easy. But then you get in, but the complicated that factor with this is an individual, what if she's raised a discrimination claim, which this person did, in the home country, and now we're dealing with issues of, you hate Indians and that's why you're firing me, or you hate women and that's why you're doing what you're doing. So it suddenly creates complications for the company to now have to decide, am I complying with both Singapore and India's laws? Because where's the place of employment at this point? And that's where these things get muddy.
That's a lot to unpack there. Does anybody have any additional thoughts on that?
I would.
Oh, so go ahead.
Yeah, I would say, and not related to business travelers getting stuck, but we put in place at ADP a temporary global remote worker policy guideline for all these people since COVID happened who have been working from home saying, I want to go work in this other country X period of time. And one of the qualifications is they have to be an employee in good standing, because I don't want to be in that scenario where they go off, they're somewhere else for 2-3 weeks, and all of a sudden, oh, for some reason we need to let them go, but you're doing it while they're in that remote work country. So we definitely have lots of conversations with our employment lawyers around make sure they're in the home country if we're talking about termination.
Which is great if they can get back, right?
Right, that's the challenge.
But Becky, I think you've raised another really important issue is what happens when, and how are we managing, and this is both HR and legal, what about managing these individuals long-term, their performance when they are working in these foreign locations somewhat unexpectedly? And that can be a real challenge. As you said, this individual, in addition to these other problems, actually is a performance problem. And they've had challenges trying to keep her motivated, doing her job, doing it well, remotely like this, with so many other things happening in that foreign location. So those are HR challenges that arise when we allow people in a situation to travel long term. But as we said, these are business travelers who got stuck. So now we're just sort of trying to figure out what's next. How do we untangle the situation?
Yeah, I think that's the point, Trent. Actually, this is we're still sort of coming out of this the sort of pandemic period where business travelers got stuck. We've been reactive, now we're being proactive, and then there's a sort of a sense that things are starting to open up again. But just as they did, I think you say India has just completely sort of shut down again, and that's a huge economy, and a lot of companies send people there. So when will that reopen? Big question. Who knows? But I think what I'm seeing and what we're advising on is really and it's, as Becky was saying, putting in policies and processes around, well, this business travel is going to come back. What does that look like? Is it going to be extended business trips? Are they going to become remote workers? Potentially not, but so they'll remain going backwards and forwards. From a tax perspective, then you start look to, well, you might go for a period of, let's say, 1 week, 2 weeks, maybe a month, maybe up to 3 months, because you're trying to utilize tax treaty protection at various times. But then it's the cumulative nature of those trips over the course of a period. It's not just each trip necessarily individually. And I know that was sort of pre-pandemic, that was kind of the mantra of don't forget, it's not just that each trip individually, it's the cumulative nature. But I think we might have forgotten that a little bit because no one's flown for like 16 months. But as people are traveling, potentially going to open up and travel backwards and forwards, it is that tracking, the monitoring, assessment that becomes, you really are sort of looking at the micro nature of, what are your employees doing? What sort of bucket do they fall into in this new sort of workforce that isn't just you're in the office or you're not? It's you might be between two locations, you might be in multiple locations, you might just be at home.
David, you have your firm provides a tracking tool, I believe, right?
It does, yes.
Are you having much success with our employers actually tracking employees at this point? Do you know? Anybody?
Yeah, that's a good question, actually. So pre-pandemic, absolutely. I think there's always a bit of hesitance in this space. It was like, do we really need to implement a big technology or have a sort of software as a service? I think certainly during the pandemic, towards sort of end of last year, and certainly into this sort of Q1, a lot of companies are doing exactly what Becky's doing now, is looking at, well, okay, this is here to stay. We've heard it for many years. It's been accelerated. What's the next step? We need to look at some system that will help us track, monitor, and manage that risk and compliance. But there's some other aspects to this now, and selfishly, I don't, I'm in a silo with tax, right? That's what I look at. But certainly in the last 8 months, it's broadened out. It's not just tax, obviously it's immigration as well, I should say. It's now duty of care, and I think that's where it's employment law, it's the benefit side of it, the health. Can someone travel to that country? And some of these systems now, and certainly when we have, no plug intended, is looking at that more holistic approach, because I think that's really, really important. That's what corporate companies are looking for, is a sort of one-stop shop to all of these issues in one go, rather than just, oh, you just deal with tax, great, thanks. I don't need that bit, I need this bit as well.
Hey, Trent, a question for you. Are there any legal issues with these tracking tools being permitted? They're allowed to track people?
I suppose it depends on how you're tracking them. So yes, are there issues? Yes, and depends on the location. But do we need to track, and can you get consent? And many places consent's enough, right? You're asking them to travel for you, and if they're based in the United States, it's not a big deal. If they're based and you're tracking them across Europe or South Korea or some of these other places that have more aggressive data privacy rules, then your strategies may need to change a bit. So yeah, it's a great point. And I think what each of you have raised is, as we think about individuals starting up again with their business travel, like what are the key things that companies need to remember? And on my list are these things you've talked about. Are our policies ready for individuals to start traveling again? Do they appropriately address the insurances that we're going to need? And when we talk about that, you've mentioned, what if they're traveling to, this came up with Zika, right? So they're traveling and they get COVID again, or we have another surge. Are we dealing with that? And what's going to happen if they get stuck? Are we ready for business travelers to do that? And have we provided some forethought about how this is going to go? Those are some of the issues. And then of course your tax and tracking, because I suspect that our travelers are going to want to go. I know at our firm, all the lawyers are like, I got to visit all my clients. I haven't seen them in a year. So we're going to have people going back and forth to all these places, and maybe they're going to suddenly be there, more than a small amount of time trying to make up for lost time. So are we ready to manage those risks as well on a tax basis? The employment side, there's not that many issues unless they get stuck, provided you have good policies in place and you've managed the data privacy and duty of care issues.
Hey, Richard, just before we move on, just your point, yeah, I've loosely used the term tracking there. Tracking GPS, or, I'll say this controversially, I've had the vaccine, so obviously I am being tracked right now by the government. But there's no, the idea behind it is not to track via GPS system or anything like that. We are looking at travel data, expense data, badge swipes, anything that says, maybe the employees checking in via an app on their phone. So it's not Big Brother. It's very much what information do you have as an employer that can be shared to help manage risk. And to your point, there are in Europe, there are works councils and all sorts that do not like that term tracking. So that was my bad for using that term. Monitoring maybe might be a softer approach.
Well, and even I know the joke in the industry has been, wouldn't it be easy if we could just put a chip in everyone and then we'd always know where they are? But even like we talked about, can we look at people's IP addresses and where are they logging in from? And it's not something we pursued, but we definitely discussed it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's been on the table as well. Yeah, and all these sorts of, what infringes an individual's, do you want to know where, do you want your employees to know where you are? So it's it's a tricky topic, but there are other means of data sources that we can look at.
All right, well, let's get into the commuters part of this discussion here. So next question, we're gonna start off with Richard to answer. Commuters got stuck during the pandemic as well, but in a different way. Instead of commuters going from, for example, Canada, Detroit, or Buffalo, they are now working 100% from Canada. Tell me what sort of issues can come up with that. Richard?
Well, first question, why do you want to work in Detroit and Buffalo when you can come to California? California is wonderful, except for the earthquakes, the fires, the mudslides, and of course our high tax rate. And of course, it costs $1 million to have a condominium. It's a one-bedroom condominium. In fact, we just lost a seat in in Congress because people are leaving our state. Now, having said all that, and I have to believe in Detroit and Buffalo, wonderful cities and super upcoming cities, that there are issues. It shouldn't be if it's all planned in advance. If pre-pandemic you had a policy, likely a private policy, to supplement the government health insurance program called GHIP in Canada, and when you cross the border, that other policy would come into effect. This is medical we're talking about, right? Disability, you have the same issues I've talked to you about before. If you have a disability policy in Canada, you'll be fine as long as you go back to Canada to collect the benefits. The issue around a lot of this is when you have these commuters, you have the Detroit US company tend to put them under the US plan because it's easier, right? You don't need to have another plan for someone in Canada, even though they're residents in Canada. They do have National Health Canada. But the issue is not that, it's the moving back and forth, because the national system in Canada will not provide coverage outside of Canada unless it's a cover that they can't provide. For example, stem cell replacement. You can actually go out of the Canada to have that done in Germany, and it will be covered by the National Health System because it just isn't a product Canada can produce or provide. Those are the only exceptions. So you have to have some sort of a private policy going back and forth. That's really Canadian born. That means with Manulife, Canada Life, Sun Life. Those happen to be 3 top carriers in Canada. There are, by the way, 50 of them that are in Canada, unlike the United States, even elsewhere a lot. But the 3 top ones are those providers, and you need a private policy. And as long as you have that, you'll be fine going back and forth.
Okay, thank you for that. And Becky, did you experience any of these issues at ADP?
Yeah, and it actually impacted us more from a split payroll tax compliance perspective. So we have people, and a lot actually within Europe, who, for example, they live in Belgium and they work in Belgium 3 days a week, and they're in France 2 days a week. And so we had set up the split payroll accordingly in both countries so we could be compliant from a tax perspective. And we just continued on because we did know that there were some people who were those intra-European commuters who were still able to do that in 2020. But we found out, towards the end of the year that, there was somebody who actually, she was now spending 100% of her time in Belgium, and we still had the split payroll going. So we were still paying the French taxes and not paying a lot of Belgium taxes. And all of a sudden it's right before the end of the tax year. And she says, wait, I'm going to be in an under withholding situation. And so that we had to do a lot of quick adjustments before year end, and then take a look at who are all the rest of the commuters we know about. Is anyone else in the same scenario? And do some quick changes. So that, caught us by surprise as well.
Well, I suppose if any employer can handle split payroll, it ought to be ADP, right?
That's right.
Yeah. David, do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, I think echoing the other panelists' thoughts there and comments, a lot of this, I think one of the biggest issues is identification of these of this type of employee. Sorry. So, obviously, if we're looking at coming out of the pandemic and some sort of return to normality and pre-pandemic, identifying commuters was quite a difficult task for an employer, because obviously you're looking at, well, someone's employed somewhere, but we don't often, they might have their home address in the HRIS system, but how often have you actually, as a business, matched the two up? So there's probably some work to do around that point. I think that the pandemic has obviously thrown up exactly the scenario that Becky was sort of describing. I mean, typically, historically, where you work, you pay your tax and your social security. So that, to some extent, that's relatively straightforward. A lot of countries and even states have agreements in place just between, even not at a tax treaty level, just some sort of reciprocity agreement to cover those eventualities, so that they know that people are going to, if you're living on the border of France and Italy, it's likely that you don't need any immigration control. You could work in any country, in either country. So there's a lot around, what does that look like? What are the agreements saying? What does one country allow versus, if let's say France know that they've got Italian nationals working in their country, what are their sort of rules saying around allowing or their tax position? So then you start to, as a result of the pandemic, as Becky was saying, you get someone now stuck back in Italy when actually they're on a French payroll. That throws up a whole scenario of pain potentially. So I think there is very much that review of identifying who your employees are as commuters to start with, and then secondly, just looking at the tax authorities' sort of requests and requirements as part of that. Just to throw in a few others very quickly, if you look at the UK, there's some, this is again a bit around business travellers, but there's equally reporting there for people in and out of the country on a business travel agreement, short-term business traveller agreement, I should say. Canada has some pretty strict rules as well. I'm going back to our example there, just around requirements of working in Canada. Very different approach to the US around payroll, T4s, and ultimately application of waivers, applying for waivers for the individual employee or the employer to reduce that payroll burden. So lots to unpack in that one. So first of all, identifying who the commuters are and then working out what those arrangements are between each country from a payroll, social security, and then ultimately tax perspective is vital. And different rules apply regionally and against each country. And I'll stop talking.
Thanks for that. And any final thoughts on that topic there, Trent, from you?
Yeah, absolutely. I've got lots of thoughts, but I'll narrow them down. Actually, my first thought is, Becky, I think gave some really good points about commuters being proactive, understanding how much time they were spending in each location. And I suspect that there's been some effort there too about figuring out what entitlements they may have, not just on the payroll side, but in HR sort of compliance side. Commuters present a particular challenge. So let's take France and Belgium for an example. If I'm spending 3 days a week at my home in Belgium, and I'm spending 2 days a week at the office in France, those are two European systems. But when it comes to employment law, they're very different in terms of their entitlements. You're working in France with a maximum of 35 hours per week. You've got significant restrictions on the right to terminate. You have extensive protections for leave. Belgium, on the other hand, does have extensive leave protections, but their ability to terminate is a much easier process than what you find in France. And they don't have the same rules or limitations we see in France on some of the work and hours issues. So when you have a commuter that's crossing national boundaries like that, and it comes time to terminate that individual, it becomes hard for the employee to figure out which laws do I need to apply by, right? If I abide by France and they like the severance that they would get in Belgium better, then they could go to the Belgium authorities and claim that their place of employment was Belgium and seek that. Vice versa, if I try to sue them or fire them under Belgium law and they say you don't have cause under French law, then we could see a French court getting involved in that. So anytime we allow a commuter to cross national boundaries, before you allow it, if possible, most of the time we find out after the fact and we're like, what? Okay, not most of the time, but sometimes we do. But if you can, take time to figure out what that's really going to look like, and if there's a way you can manage which law is going to apply. A lot of countries, like Europe, does have regulations that talk about where's your habitual place of employment, and you can contract around some of these issues as long as you're meeting the minimum mandatory entitlements of the other jurisdiction, which most of the time you are. So that pre-planning on a commuter is essential so that you're not stuck with two laws governing that relationship. The problem with COVID is we had individuals sitting in New York City who'd been going to the office every day, and now they're working 3 days a week from their home in New Jersey or Connecticut, and then only heading into New York City every so often. So it's a similar issue I just talked about with France and Belgium. Connecticut's laws and New Jersey's protections are different than New York City protections in a lot of key ways. And so with the at-home workers, and we're seeing more of that, if we're going to allow them to work across a state boundary, and sometimes even a city boundary, it can trigger additional paid sick leave entitlements, additional termination protections. We may have disability contributions or unemployment. Well, most states have unemployment sort of reciprocity issues, rules, but those are things that need to be thought about in advance when it comes to your employment. How does my policy account for this? And do I have a process in place that will allow us to comply if we're going to allow people to cross state or national borders to commute?
All right, excellent. Thank you for that, Trent. I'm going to get a couple of, we're getting some questions that are popping in. So I'm going to ask the first one. I think, Becky, you may have already answered it, but will ADP have their own tracking software integrated in their current systems?
Definitely something we're looking at. That would be a dream of mine. I think realistically what we're pursuing right now is there a way, like David was saying, to track the, like from a Concur feed, to track all the business travel data? And because it does need to come from different sources. In the US, we do all book through our Amex Global Travel Department, and everything is in Concur, but outside of the US, people aren't booking centrally, but they are still reimbursing through Concur. So we're thinking, okay, can we grab all that data out of Concur and get it into a different system, hopefully via an automatic feed, and then it can be analyzed to say, okay, how many days is somebody where?
Excellent. All right, and I have one more question before we tackle the Brexit topic. This is a long one, so bear with me. Thoughts on building just a global remote policy versus incorporating also at a local jurisdiction level, especially since we are starting to see different location already rolling out remote legislative agreements for companies to abide by, for example, part of Latin America to address health and safety, portions of rent and utilities to be paid, hours, work, and so on. Sorry, I'm getting another question and it shifted everything on me. Maybe a miss to develop a global policy one size fits all due to these local agreements. Any thoughts on that? And does that make any sense? Looks like Trent wants first crack at it.
Yeah, so I've created those policies already for multiple companies who are doing global remote work 2 days a week, 5 days a week, whatever it is, on a global basis. And the issue, you're right, the issue is that as work from home became a bigger deal, work from home has already been legislated in a number of locations before COVID. Since COVID, we've seen a flurry of legislation in some locations, and Latin America is one of those places that's taken an aggressive and saying, if you're allowing telework, depending on the country, you have an obligation to provide them equipment, pay for their allowance, give some sort of allowance or reimbursement. You can't unilaterally change it or require them to come back. There's different rules. You've got rules in Europe that already were in place for certain teleworking. If you meet a certain number of days, you have to have an agreement in place, and it has to be big. You can't use subjective factors in France to determine who can go, meaning you can't rely on whether they're a good performer to go. That's subjective. You have to use objective factors like, is this a position that could work remotely, right? So there's a lot of rules that go into play. And to the question, can I have a global policy? Yes, you can have a global overarching policy with a lot of carve-outs that says, subject to the local version of this policy, because ultimately there are going to need to be local versions. There's going to be Works Council collective agreements that have telework provisions in them. You'll have to figure out how to make that global policy work within or separate from that agreement or legislation. But companies are doing it, and they're figuring out ways to do, how do I set a global standard, for lack of a better word, but still recognize that this standard may not be rolled out formally in every country, particularly where they have extensive telework rules already in place. Sorry.
Yeah, Steve, just to what Trent said for tax. So just put tax. Exactly the same thing. Global framework, and then you're looking at regional or country specific addendums or notations throughout. So it's just very similar approach, because there's no one size fits all. It's just impossible.
Great answer, David. Trent, we'll get back to that one.
This is a lot shorter.
Yes. But you did all the work. You did all the work. So it's how I roll. I'll just take credit.
We're getting a few more questions that pop in, but I really want to tackle the Brexit topic as it concerns commuters and business travelers. Becky, I understand you're currently addressing this issue at ADP. Can you share how you are looking to deal with these challenges now that business travelers and commuters cannot so easily travel in and out of the UK?
Yeah, we've put together a task force with our EMEA HR business partners, definitely including our UK colleagues as well. And the big concern was around people in the past have been accustomed to booking their own travel and thinking they can just go in and out of the UK, no problem, or a UK employee can go in and out of other European countries, no problem. And now it's, do they have to get a business visa? Do they have to get an A1, et cetera? And so what we've been working on is, how do we get communications out to the employees? And it's a great time right now to actually tackle this, since everyone is still mostly homebound. So we can kind of get ahead of the communications before people do truly start going out there. But we do really have concerns for the compliance piece, because what a horror story, right? You have somebody in your sales department who's getting stopped at a border, they're at the airport, they don't let them in the country. That's not good for business, that's not good for the company brand. So how can we get ahead of that?
All right, sounds like you have your hands full there with that one. Anybody have any comments on that, or should I just move on to one of the questions here that I got from the audience?
I mean, some of the, I looked at, sorry Steve, I saw one of the questions come in about pre-trip approval, and I think this is kind of, you can almost start to merge these, and then there's the Schengen area as well. They're all kind of related, and this applies globally, but if you just look at that sort of European area, I think that's quite a good sort of case study. So pre-travel, pre-trip approval, I think has been increasing in importance over the years for a number of reasons. Becky's listed a few of the aspects there: immigration, social security requirements, A1 applications, obviously with Brexit and the slightly different rules there now, and visa requirements. But there's two other things that probably come to mind. First of all would be the activities of the individual, because again, that's going to drive some of the visa aspects of it. Part of the Brexit cooperation agreement is just around, they've made they've got a list in there, handy, a list of what activities are allowed and what need sort of further compliance. So again, that's a bit more clarity in that space. But the other big one that a lot of people talk about is this posted worker directive aspects as well, and the requirements around that. That is something which I think companies are really sort of grappling with and trying to come to terms with, what are the requirements here? Is it every single trip? Is it every time you temporarily post someone working in another European state? So this is within the European Economic Area, not so it doesn't actually include Britain, but again relates to that whole pre-trip approval. So again, this is just two aspects, and I'll talk very quickly. There's a notification requirement, and then there's an A1 requirement. There's a few other sort of corporate structural aspects as well. But the idea behind it is very much driven by, if you're temporarily posting an employee to work in another state, an EU, EEA state, you need to notify that other authority. Well, what is that? You know, is that every single trip? And again, there's a little bit of a grey area. The wording in the guidance is a little bit ambiguous. Business trips is sort of covered, but they do sort of exempt various things like conferences, training. There's some countries like Spain that has up to 8 days for some sort of construction type arrangements, and there's some countries are looking at individual exemptions for after a certain number of days, just as a sort of grace period. But ultimately, if you, I would say the bottom line is, if you've got an employee going to work on a business trip into another European country and they're billing for that time, I would look at getting a notification and an A1 certificate. The border agencies are aware of this. They are starting to check people coming in and asking for that documentation. That's even from US into Europe for certificates of coverage. So I think this is a trend that we're going to see become increasingly important for companies to actually have that pre-trip approval in place, to get the documentation, manage risk, immigration, potentially vaccinations as well. We're still waiting to see what that space looks like, and that's not my area of expertise at all. And then ultimately what that looks like from Social Security and tax as well. So lots of sort of, you know, administrative processes coming up. I'll throw one last thing as well. Border agencies and tax authorities have been talking to each other for a long time. Canada, Malaysia, UK, that is going to be an increasing trend. So they're going to start to link up. So government agencies are going to start to link up their databases. So they will challenge companies. You know, have you got the right processes in place? What are you doing around your business travelers, your commuters, and remote workers? It's a no-brainer. It's the only way they're going to get revenue back in, certainly after last year.
Okay.
Sorry,
Richard has thoughts.
Yeah, with respect to medical travel, I'm just going to talk to that. You shouldn't really have so much of a problem in the European Union traveling back and forth from the UK, considering you making sure that you do have a global health insurance card, which you should have anyway if you travel. By the way, I just checked with our people in the UK, and they're not seeing much business travel yet. So it's not yet an issue so much. The countries to be concerned about are the other European countries: Switzerland, Iceland, Norway, Liechtenstein. Assuming I pronounced that properly. I'm not Liechtensteinian, I guess. But if they,
that's correct.
Did I say it correctly?
Yeah.
Oh, good. Yep, you would know. Thank you very much. So they need, you'll need a separate card for those countries. Irrespective of all that, probably should, and always a good policy. In fact, I'm curious with Becky if she's even part of this, but when anybody travels anywhere that's really outside their home territory, should always get some travel insurance policy, because you never know what's going to happen. And that's always, even if it's double protection, it's so inexpensive, those policies. Travel and medical policies. They're available even at the airport, but they're certainly available through your employer. So that's why I suggest making sure every employee has that before they go. It's where you're not going to get stuck with somebody crying or complaining or hurt that they don't have any coverage when they do get ill or in an accident overseas. Becky?
Oh, Becky, we lost your audio.
Becky, yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, at ADP, we do have global business traveler accident insurance. We do have a global death and dismemberment. But it was interesting when we were rolling out the temporary global remote work policy, there were conversations with the risk management department who said that, you know, those policies might not really actually apply to these populations or those people who were stuck by COVID. It's not true business travel. So you need to come up with another solution for that population.
Oh, very important. And by the way, you mentioned global travel accident policy, but that's different than a global travel medical policy. You may be talking about the same thing and not know it, and it may be part of it, but they're separate policies. And they would cover 24 hours. Occupational and non-occupational is really the words for it. if they have it, and every employer should. Really inexpensive, important.
All right. Well, we're pretty much at the end of the hour. It's okay if you go a little bit over, as long as you guys are okay with it. But I'd like everyone to give everyone an opportunity to share their final thoughts on remote workers in general before we end our third webinar of our three-part webinar series. And then let's start with Trent, because I know you actually have created a remote worker checklist. Do you want to talk a bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that when we're thinking about what's our approach to these remote workers, we've talked in these three programs about three different kinds. We've got the long-term remote workers, which Becky just alluded to, might include the traveler who's stuck indefinitely in a foreign location. You've got to think about transferring them, or how you're going to treat them is in a long-term way. Right? If they're in a country where you don't have an entity, are you going to keep them employed? If you are, then you need to do something about compliance with tax and employment issues through an employer of record company, or perhaps making them an independent contractor, or some other sort of long-term approach. If they're a short-term individual and working temporarily from a foreign location, what does your short-term remote work policy say? Or what do your internal guidelines say about that? And that's where this, do you have a checklist that sort of hits the key issues? Are we dealing with the employment issues? Are they crossing a national boundary? Have we addressed insurance and tax? And from my place, does the place of employment change? And when it comes to short term, I'm advocating, I know US companies hate doing anything in writing, but I strongly advocate, if you're going to allow somebody to cross a border for a short-term period, and I'm saying longer than 2 weeks or a month, we should have some letter that's filled with self-serving language that establishes their place of employment hasn't changed, acknowledges that their vacation remains the same, acknowledges that they're going to comply with the law, and they take on their own liabilities for making that decision to work across the border, usually for personal reasons rather than company reasons, right? So that's a template that that I prepared to say, look, at least you should have this in writing. It governs that those short-term risks, if in fact there's an argument about a change in the place of employment. Those are my high level.
Thank you, Trent. Becky, final thoughts from you.
Yeah, I think sitting in kind of the corporate HRC, business travel and just people working in places other than their place of employment, there's lots of different categories of those and scenarios. Biggest challenge sitting in my seat is identifying them. So if we're having a hard time getting access to travel data, if people don't tell us where they're going, that's stumbling block number one. But even once we can get our hands on it, does your team have the bandwidth to then manage it properly? Because it's a lot of work to determine the compliance and actually put it into place. So I think a lot of our discussions are, number one, how can we get our hands on the data? And number two, once you can get the hands on the data, who's responsible? Who's going to own it? And then do they have the manpower to own it? And what kind of solutions can you put in place? Is it an in-house solution? Do you rely on an external partner? So that's the discussions we're having now. It's a lot of fun, but more to come.
Excellent. Thank you, Becky. And David.
Yeah, actually, I was writing some notes down. It's almost as if I'd passed them along like that to Becky. That was great. Exactly that. I think there's so many different categories now of workforce. The future of work and all these sort of terms are being bandied around. I think understanding and knowing what categories there are and how you get data to support what those types, those workforce categories are actually doing, who's in them, and then what do you need to do to monitor, not track, monitor where they are. Certainly from my world, that's really important. And using technology, process, and policy to do that is helps with the compliance and risk management. And then you unpack all that with HR, performance, talent management, retention, virtual assignments. We didn't even touch on that in these three series. It's like, what happens if you're trying to hire someone in a completely different country to do a job in the US? Unless they stay there, what does that look like from a corporate perspective? So much more to come. But I think tiny bite-sized chunks to begin with is the way forward.
All right. Thank you, David. And last but not least, Richard.
Oh, thank you. I think first is employee has to want to be helped, and they have to trust the employer that they're going to be there to help them, and then therefore need to know where they are. Because it's not just a tax issue for the employer, as we saw, or a legal issue for the employer, it's also for the employee. And then therefore also for insurance purposes, it's that issue too. Employees have to take responsibility for themselves and their lives and not be a victim and then blame an employer. But all employees need coverage and life insurance. They need retirement, they need disability, they need health care. And the only way an employer can help them if they know where they are. And they're no matter where. But one thing is for sure, if you leave where you are, have a travel medical policy, either individually or by the employer. Thank you.
Thank you. And one big thank you again to all the panelists, Trent, Becky, David, and Richard. Wonderful of you to share your thoughts. Thank you so much for your time. As a reminder to everybody, this webinar will go up on our website, gtn.com. We also have a tremendous amount of information out there on our resources tab. So if you haven't signed up for our newsletter, please do so. We put a lot of content out there, and it's the best way that GTN can keep in touch with you. And lastly, I just want to thank everybody for the time again, and do your best to stop the spread. Get vaccinated as soon as you can, and stay safe, everybody. Take care.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you
Thanks,
very
Steve.
much.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you, guys. And Becky, thanks very much.
Thank you.